parish orphans and retrogrades worldwide. I'm Tim. This is my brother Dave. We're excited to introduce our friend, our Twitter friend, our social media friend, Mr. Eric Sammons, to the show. Everyone out there, welcome Mr. Eric Sammons. How are you, Eric?
Oh, I'm doing great. How are you guys doing?
We're doing well. Yeah, thank you. Good to have you on. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You know, this is a Saturday morning. It will be airing on Monday. So what's up, Monday people? What's up, future? There are still people that will watch like every show, and they try to talk to us on live chat, and they're like, "Wow, you're good at talking while you're typing on the premiere, Tim." I'm like, I'm not. I like to juggle, but I can't actually juggle that.
Well, how's it going, all you unhappy people on your way to work right now?
Right.
Saturday morning for us. We're in a much better place than you are.
Hey, watch it. You're talking to future me.
Right.
Did you just insult me 2 days in the future? You punk.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to listen to this on your way to work in the car and be like, dang it.
Yeah, man, Eric, I feel it's funny. This happened when we had Steve S. on the show.
Yes.
No, that's giving away too much information. Let's call him S. Skojek. Okay, so no, not everyone else knows who he is out there. It's legit. I'm not trying to gush, but for years we're not only are me, you, and Dave really of all the people out there kind of in the same headspace. So is Steve, like traditional minded, traditional liturgically, all that. But we were both writing articles for Catholic Answers Mag at the same time, and they're not traditional leaning or whatever. Dave and I actually, the first time I ever saw your name in print, I'd seen you on the internet once, but Dave and I co-authored an article for Catholic Answers called like Against Wimpy Evangelization. Remember that, Dave? And you were in that article, I believe. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. I mean, it's cool. So shout out to the editor of Catholic Answers Mag, notwithstanding all the other Catholic Answers drama. He goes out and gets good people like yourself.
Yeah, he does. I appreciate the stuff I've done for them, and I do think they put out some good stuff. I know there's a lot of drama involved with them, but I think they've done a lot of good work over the years. In fact, it was Catholic Answers when I was Protestant in the early 90s that some Catholic friends gave me some Catholic Answer stuff. It was called This Rock Magazine at the time, no online stuff. And it really helped me become Catholic. And I'll always be thankful Carl Keating and what he did in building Catholic Answers. I know it's helped a lot of people besides me too.
Hey, why did they change from This Rock? I never got the full story on that. And it's always something I wondered.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it was just a branding thing that they wanted Catholic Answers, the name, to be out there. So that now it's just Catholic Answers Mag. And I think it was just really the branding of, okay, Catholic Answers, put it on everything. I don't know that for sure, but from what I've heard, that's basically was just the idea. Whereas This Rock Magazine, you don't necessarily know who publishes it as clearly. So
I think the AA, what is it? The AAPG, the International Association of Geologists, we're taking issue with that. Like these are all our rocks.
Yeah, this is not your rock.
These are the earth, or as Pope Francis would say, these are the earth's rocks or Pachamama's rocks, right?
They were.
Well, it sounds a little Jehovah's Witnessy, like Watchtower. You know, where does this really have to do with God? Maybe we should figure out a different name.
Right.
This God.
You know what? They realized they were committing an ecological sin, and they repented of it, and they changed their name. So.
Right. Well, speaking of drama, Eric, you've always been supportive, like brother from another mother. We get into these ridiculous things on Twitter. You're not a drama guy. We're not drama guys, but you get sucked in 2020 early spring Catholic world, right? I mean, we were all sucked into that Catholic Answers thing, and then no one wanted that whirlpool. Yeah. Recently, if we're speaking of drama, maybe you can clear something up for me. What is a grift? From what I can tell by the internet, it means go ahead and do free shows and free products on YouTube, but you have to give your books away. What is the deal?
Grifting is, according to all the intellectuals I've read on Twitter, is making money.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if you make money, if you are not living in your parents' basement and using their internet connection and their computer, you're a grifter. So, yeah, the whole thing is silly.
And if you make any money ever.
Exactly. The whole thing is silly because the idea, it's this weird it's terrible economic knowledge, first of all, and it's like a pseudo-socialism idea that somehow making money for the work you do, if it's at all associated with the Catholic faith, it's somehow now sinful and grifting. And that grifting itself is when you deceive people to give you money for something.
Know.
And it's like, so here you are saying, I'm going to give you videos, I'm going to write books for you, I'm going to give you content, and in exchange, I'm asking you to voluntarily donate some of your money to me so I can continue to do that. No deception, no like faking people out, no like asking for one thing and doing that. If anybody's a grifter, it's a USCCB and Peter Pence and people like that, because they claim, give us money and we'll give you the Catholic faith, we'll give to the poor, stuff like that. Instead, they're funding, you know, Elton John, homosexual movies and things like that. That's grifting.
They should.
Yeah, right.
But careful what you say now. It's very soon, according to some sources in the Vatican, the USCCB is going to have magisterial status, and they're gonna come after you, Mr. Sammons.
Bring it on.
Let me say something on that note. You know, it's a ridiculous concept to attach grifting to this moniker grifter to somebody who's trying to work for the church. You know, I take special umbrage with it because before I went into parish ministry, I was a practicing attorney, right? So then in order to leave the law and do something for Christ, to do something full time for Christ, you know, I took a pay cut, and then I went and I was working in a parish and as an RCIA director, and to attach like the label grifter, if you're going to be in parish ministry full time, you have to earn a wage, right? You have to feed your family. And if you're not in it full time, then the positions are going to be filled with other people who, you know, maybe aren't as serious about their faith. So it's especially irksome, I guess, to when people say this and throw this out. It's like, you know, I left the law, right, to do something in ministry. That's not grifting. You know, the opportunity cost was great. It's just I have a few kids that I need to feed. They like to eat. I don't know about your guys' kids. Do they eat?
Yeah, sometimes.
Okay.
On Christmas and Easter, I feed them. But that's just if they're good.
One of the problems is, and this is going to be more apt in the traditional Catholic world, is that the ideal situation is that most evangelization, most parish work, most all that stuff is going to be run by priests and nuns. That is the ideal. That is what would be great to happen. And so I think there's a little bit of an idea of like, well, back in the 50s, you didn't have lay people like us doing stuff like this.
Right.
And so it was like somehow that makes it wrong. The problem is we're just in reality. And the reality is that the priest, most people, there's not as many priests, the not as many nuns, and a lot of them do really terrible stuff. You have Father James Martin, people like that doing terrible things. And so there's this void, there's this vacuum that needs to be filled where good, authentic Catholic evangelization teaching happens. Right. And so lay people have stepped up and said, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to give up my job as an attorney like you did. I know Skojek, he gave up a good paying job, you know, to do this because I feel like there's a vacuum that needs to be filled because I see all these people who are confused about our present crisis. They don't know really what they're supposed to think about different things. And so they need content, they need teaching. And so we step into the void. And the funny thing is like, I always think it's funny with me because I don't make a living with these commentaries, my tweets and stuff like that. But it's like the idea that somehow that's an immoral thing or grifting is just silly, but it would be great. I mean, I would love it if there was a day where the three of us don't have to do stuff like this because there's a bunch of on fire traditional priests and sisters out there who are all doing it. And we can get jobs in the secular world again. That would be great. I would love
actually. That. I'm nodding my head. I actually disagree. I love doing it. So maybe I am a grifter. No, I mean I love talking because what I do is really Catholic philosophy, Catholic culture, Catholic politics. So Dave's the theology guy. You're a theology guy. So I mean Dave and I make a good team there. I'll handle the Thomistic philosophy. He'll handle the Thomistic theology, if you will. And so I mean, to me, this is better if you can make it work than being a professor. I'm just kidding, though. I understand what you're saying. The evangelization should be getting handled by the episcopus and whatever. Speaking of which, I would like to thank Rorate Chaley yesterday. I wasn't going to do this online on Twitter because it gets so like girlish, but thank you very much. I'm looking at you. You brought me through that display of tantrum, man tantrum yesterday. Brought in like 5 or 6 new patrons. So
Awesome.
Do we call that a mantrum? Can we just go ahead and throw it out there?
Yeah.
let's
Some
do
things
it.
are too perfect, like lunch and breakfast. You want to put them together. It's like, what am I gonna do? Not call it brunch?
I'm going to call
same
that
with
one
mantrum.
breakfast. Yeah, it rolls off the tongue tonight. Or
Mantrum
brunch.
is good,
They already did that. Yeah.
And
Right.
the truth is, I'm a big believer in the free market, and I know some traditional Catholics aren't.
Can we talk about that?
Yeah, well, the fact is that the simple fact is, if you did not provide a service that people were interested in, you simply wouldn't get paid, and you have to find a job at McDonald's or wherever. I mean, the fact is that it's all freely and it's all voluntary exchange. You're not providing anything immoral. Obviously, that would be wrong if you're providing. I'm not arguing for prostitution. But at the same time, I am arguing that if you're doing something that's not immoral, and it's, in fact, in this case, moral, and people are voluntarily willing to give you money, then good. And if you're terrible at it, then they won't give you money, and you'll go ahead to find something else. So it shows that you're.
That's why I don't make that much. No.
Look, it's a whole other show. It's a whole other show topic. We've been talking about this with John Zmerok off the wire. Socialism is back in a really frightful way, and I think this is a big concern of mine. It's a big issue related to Catholic Republic, and I will do another show on that. But what's at the heart of all of it is live action role play. Let's come around to our main issue. How does one say in a romantic way, lowercase r, I want to return to a discipline of the church. I won't tell you guys which one it is. A discipline of the church, because the new one is tacky and has been inefficacious. It's 100% valid. I want to return to this, but I don't want to do it in a way where I'm pretending that it's the year 1968 or 1964. I realize that fashions change. I mean, because literally some of the same people will be like, Tim, we like how, you want to go back to Latin Mass. I think it should be completely universal. This is really what we're going to talk about with you today, Eric. But I don't need to pretend. I don't need to go find like the clothing lines from the 1960s or the.
As you're wearing a polka dot shirt straight out of like 1955, by the way.
That's
that
what I'm saying.
Has not
I go
been,
back to
like loomed since.
You thought that this wasn't spun by a loom?
Whatever you call it. What industry do you think I'm in? Where I don't know what the verb is. Woven?
I don't know.
I don't know. Knitted?
That wasn't produced by a machine. Nevertheless, it seems to be a real issue, Eric, does it not, of prudence to say, and it can be correctly done. I think people like you, Steve Skojek, do it better than almost anyone I've ever seen. You can prudentially kind of thread the needle and say, I want to go back to this, but not that. We don't all have to talk like Cusick, like we're from a Renaissance fair or something, just to be Latin Mass Catholics,
Right. And I think that's a great point, because I got hammered one time. I said something on Twitter about, like, I don't want it to be like it was in the 1950s. And some trads were like, oh my gosh, see, you're not really a traditional Catholic. It's like, okay, fine. I don't care how you want to use the label, whatever it is. But I look at it like just a matter of, you see what works and what doesn't, very practically. And the fact is, a lot of the changes that happened in the 60s and 70s and things like that did not work. But that does not necessarily mean that doing it exactly as it was done in 1953 in every single way, not just the liturgy, but in everything, has to be, that's going to work today. Because the truth is, and this actually is a great segue to the topic, one of the things that I think traditional Catholics, since most people watching this are probably more traditional Catholics, I feel like I can kind of talk to them a little bit more and criticize some of our assumptions. One of the things we have to realize is Vatican II is not the only source of all problems in the church today. It's not that everything was perfect and nothing would have been wrong if we just hadn't had Vatican II. The fact is, the culture changed radically. And I'm talking Western culture here, mostly America, Europe, Western Europe. And because the culture changed so radically from the way it was in the 1930s and 20s and things like that, we can't simply go back to the way it was then, because the culture changed. And so we have to adapt and realize, okay, how can we take the things that were good and true and beautiful and done properly back in the 50s and the 40s, things like that, and then apply it to today's culture, which whether we like it, I mean, I'm not saying that's a good thing that the culture changed so much. I'm just saying that it's what happened. And so then we have to apply it to today's culture and hopefully impact the culture. To be effective, I think that's what we have to do. We have to balance that of, okay, look at the things that were great about the church back then, but now adapt it to today's culture, which is very, very different to the way it was in, let's say, the 1930s.
You know, partly the point of Vatican II, it was a way to respond to modernism. It was a way to dialogue with the church. And that's what gets lost. You know, a lot of people say, well, it's a capitulation to modernism. And in a way, in a sense that this council has been implemented, and maybe some of the backroom dealings that were happening on the part of a segment of bishops, that's true. But in the form of it, you know, if you were to talk to Pope John the 23rd, he would say, this is what we're trying to do to respond to the scourge of modernism. So although it's not just a talking point, there really is this disjuncture between the purpose of the council and what kind of spawned it in the minds of the popes. The way the church is going to interface with the culture goes back to Pius XII. He talks about this in Mediator Dei. There's this divide between the purpose of the council and how it came to be, you know, as a brainchild of these holy fathers, and then the way it's been implemented and some of the way that a certain segment of bishops wanted to use it.
I was just going to say, you're absolutely right. And the one thing that's important to know is that Vatican II, the average bishop going to Vatican II, that's exactly what he wanted to do with Vatican II, was to address the changing culture and say, how can the church now adapt to that? Now, there was a segment of bishops at Vatican II who wanted to use it as an opportunity to embrace full-on modernism. And so what you have is in the documents themselves, you have this ambiguity that allows for that later. And so I would argue that the documents themselves are very problematic, not because they are endorsing full-on modernism and heresy, but because they have this intentional ambiguity in them so that later in the implementation, there could be full-on modernism. And you'd really have the problems. But ultimately, the reason for Vatican II wasn't a bad one. The reason of most people, I mean, your bishop who's coming from, you know, Illinois to the council, he's not some full-on modernist. He's coming because he's like, yeah, I'm starting to see the impact of the culture here, and I think we probably do need to do a few things differently to figure out how to do it. Now, of course, intentions are only one thing. It's not just intentions, it's actual results. And that's where, of course, we get the big problem is you get the greatest intentions in the world, but if you stink at your job, you're still going to stink at your job. It doesn't matter what your intentions are.
This is where, this is one of the last shows I did with Dr. Marshall. There are two types of textualism, right? There's Scalian textualism where you're taking a document at its original public meaning. And then the second type is it's like Stanley Fish is the head of intentionalism. In constitutional law or reading any regular text, reading a sacred text is the same. I've always been a textualist where you take the words at their original public meaning, many times ignoring what the private intention of the author might have been. It's in this sense that I can say, look, I mean, we weren't doing a whole thing on the hermeneutic of continuity, but in that sense, and in that sense alone, I can say, yes, the original public meaning of these texts, these 12 or 14 constitutions, whatever it is, they were correctly wrought in such a way that they did not run afoul of any direct modernism, like we're all agreeing here. Vatican II is valid, obviously, particularly with regard to discipline, because it was a disciplinary council. Those bad intentions are still important. And here's what's not important. This is what I really liked about your tweet, Eric, when I asked you to come on. And you're going to talk about this book, Mass Exodus. It's a discipline, man. I mean, for the record, all three of us agree that when what we're banding about with the real live modernists in the church, who are the ones that do love Vatican II, we're banding about it. It's just it was unsuccessful. It was wildly unsuccessful. Just change it back. There's no, and I don't see what I think all three of us are in agreement from private conversation. I don't want just an extraordinary form mass from Summorum Pontificum, as implemented, I hate myself. I want to punch myself in the face even when I say those words, as implemented. That's all the discipline is as implemented. It has no other form. There's no platonic form of a discipline. As implemented, it's been horrible, and it's brought many people away from the faith. And all the young people now, if we're interested in aggiornamento, bringing the church into where the world is now, everybody wants the Latin Mass. Just do away with it. You tried it for 2.5 generations. It didn't work. The only people that liked it were people that like the Doors and the Monkees and things like that. And it's old. It's time has come. Let's change it back, and let's change it back universally.
And I was a computer programmer, and one of the things when computers running for a while, sometimes things go wrong and everything gets bucked up. And if you reboot it, you're back to where you were, and you can kind of start over. And I kind of look at it like that. Like, I would love to see a reboot, not to the sense that we go back to 1955 and then we just statically stay there and we don't ever change anything ever again until our Lord comes back. No, I don't mean that. What I mean is realize, okay, we tried these things. It got gunked. The computer got gunked up, and we needed to do a reboot to get this started over, because it's just the reality is it just doesn't work. And the analogy's been done. I've done it myself at 1 Peter 5. Other people have done it. The analogy with New Coke is always the good one.
It is.
Coca-Cola released this. They thought this was going to be great, but they were smart enough to see after a few months, oh my gosh, this is a disaster. This is a Titanic disaster. And so we need to just go back to old Coke. I mean, they tried to play it off a little bit of Coke Classic for a little while, but everybody knew. They really and give them credit for recognizing it. I mean, how many people? I mean, if I wrote an article about this one time. If it was bishops running Coca-Cola, they just keep on going on New Coke and just say, nope, there's nothing wrong with New Coke. The fact that Pepsi now, everybody's drinking Pepsi, nobody drinks our product, it's their fault, not ours. We'll just stick with New Coke. And that's what we're doing with the changes that happened after Vatican II with the new Mass and everything. We have this disaster all around us, and nobody's just saying, well, nobody high up in the church is really saying, okay, let's just realize this is a failed experiment. Start over. Doesn't mean we're never, ever going to make some adjustments to the liturgies and things like that. It just means for right now, what we need to do is kind of take a breath, go back to what we know works, and then from there, move forward with our evangelization and our reform of the church and things like that.
And it's not something that even we'd have to walk back the council documents, right? You're not going to have to be like, I recall Sacrosanctum Concilium. It's no longer of valid force or effect. Here's the thing. There has been, because the traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Mass, is such a thing of beauty, right? We all agree. It's very beautiful. It's very pious. There's been this notion on the part of the faithful, because in comparison to the Novus Ordo, it's like up here in terms of piety and reverence, right? And it's not necessarily the Novus Ordo, but at least the way in 99.9% of our parishes it's being played out, right? With the silly music and the people in just street clothes, like daring to touch the body of Christ with their hands. They're handing it out like it's Triscuit crackers, right? So the Novus Ordo, there's this disparity between the reverence of the TLM and the Novus Ordo. But then because of that disparity, people have this idea that the TLM is impeccable, as if there's nothing about it that could have ever changed. And that's not consonant with the church's magisterium. Pope Pius XII in Mediator Dei called for specific reforms to the liturgy because certain parts of it had become redundant. There were a lot of repetitions, he says. And, people were not engaging in a way that they were actively offering up the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ with the priest. They would be doing private devotions in Mass instead of, and that's the real definition of active participation, right? It's not singing and like waving your hands around. It's praying in union with the rest of the ecclesia and offering up this sacrifice in union with the priest. So there were things that could have gotten better about the TLM. It's not like we reached this point in the 16th century where we were at the pinnacle, the absolute zenith of liturgical worship. There were always things that could have been better about the TLM, as great and as reverent and as pious and as beautiful as it is. And so Sacrosanctum Concilium comes along, and the point was to really make this thing into something that could interface with the culture, because the liturgy is the privileged place. We could really stamp out modernism a lot with the liturgy, right? And so there's these good motivations that go into Sacrosanctum Concilium. I think the problem is people need to be like, time out. We lost at a critical phase of the implementation of this document, whether it's, when they're drafting up the actual new mass and the missals that are going to implement these council documents or whatever. That's something that I would even say that might be beyond my pay grade right now. I'm not studied up on it. But at some point, at some critical phase, we lost something in the implementation of these documents. Yeah. And not that the documents are necessarily perfect in and of themselves.
Well, I think that the problem is that the church changes over time, but what changes they are slow and organic changes. That's why we call them development.
Right.
And I'm not going to get, let's not go down the rabbit hole of does doctrine change? We know it doesn't. But when I say change, I mean the sense that, yeah, let's not go there. But they're slow and organic. The changes that happened after Vatican II were very fast and bureaucratic. And that's the key difference, is that so the liturgy has over time developed, but it's been a slow and organic development. So if you went to a mass in, let's say, 900 AD versus 1900 AD, you would know this is the same thing, but yet you would see a lot of things different. Right. But those differences happened over 1,000 years. Whereas if you go to a mass in 1900 versus a typical mass in 2000, just 100-year time frame there, it would be, if you're really paying attention, you'd say, okay, it is still the mass, but it would be so radically different. You'd be like, what happened that it changed so quickly? And so really it changed by committee. It was just it was a committee of a bunch of, bureaucratic ecclesiastical bureaucrats in the 60s who said, okay, now we're going to tinker with it. We're going to make it more, we're going to simplify it. They claim to make it more like it was in the pristine early days, which I think that's a false presupposition that earlier is always better than later. I don't think that's true, because I think the fact is the Holy Spirit leads the church, and therefore over time, there are aspects of things that do get better actually over time. And so just saying, oh, we want it to be like it was in 100 AD, which I don't think, by the way, the new Mass is more like it was in 100 AD than the traditional Latin Mass, but they claim that. That's where we have this now a break with tradition, because we see it's no longer this organic and slow development where, let's say you say in a 100-year time frame, maybe you add the name of St. Joseph to the canon. And that's like literally all you do over 100 years. That's a slow and organic change, because there may been a big development devotion to St. Joseph, and there's a decision to do that. But when all of a sudden you just say, okay, we're going to do everything differently, it's just going to be a big experiment for the next 5 or 10 years where we're just going to change everything here and there, that's not Catholic. That is not a way of doing things.
Yeah, so it's still a bimodal distribution. That no one out has come up with a better analogy than old Coke, new Coke. Yeah. And I think what's fallacious in saying, well, for one thing, Dave, I don't think anyone agrees on the intent. We don't have to talk about it, but no one here agrees that the intention behind Sacrosanctum Concilium was good. The intention is evidenced by the fact that the bishops haven't been Coca-Cola brand corporation and responded to the changes, right? That makes it all but certain in my mind, but we don't have to discuss that. Why the bimodal distribution? Even given the subtle distinction of degree, even though that's all represents technically a bunch of little changes, 1,000 little changes, it's still most helpful to think of all of that as old Coke, right? It's when you have the big distinction of kind, a bunch of theological revolutionaries who wanted to softwire modernism into the Mass, lex orandi, lex credendi. They knew it would do exactly what it did. They're happy it did exactly what it did. And that's why they won't change. That's the only conceivable reason they won't change it back. Therefore, talking about the miniature, organic, slow, living, breathing changes done to old Coke, no one even cares. That was all still old Coke. It's when Coca-Cola brand said, we're going to go to new Coke, we're forcing you on it, and we will literally force into retirement, who knows? Maybe old popes that wanted to reform the reform. They're coming up with St. Gallen Mafias Part 1 and 2 because there was this one guy knowing from maybe wanting to reform the reform in a really underwhelming way anyway. I'm talking about Benedict the 16th. They are committed to New Coke. They accomplished what they wanted to accomplish with it. It's not at all likenable to the slow distinctions of degree happening within old Coke. No one complained if Coca-Cola was slowly modifying the parts per million of small subtle ingredients in old Coke. That all happened, like we know.
It was more like they
That's
were
fine.
just changing the bottle. They're
Right.
just changing the bottle. They're not changing as much as like New Coke actually changes fundamental things.
Right.
With the prayers and things like that. It's still valid, it's still a Coke, so to speak, but it's very different. It's a change in kind, like you said.
If it's not, okay, Eric, you answer this. Why? Okay, it's very simple, right? I'm going to say it slowly. Why are they so terrified of going back? They don't care about aggiornamento, right? Bringing the church into the world or updating it or whatever. They see the world, the young people hate it. I mean, it's tacky. Let's just say that. Objectively, it's tacky. And there is, like I said, there's no platonic form for a discipline because disciplines can change. We don't even have to abrogate it, right? You don't even have to say Sacrosanctum Concilium that never happened. We just say, yeah, it happened for 60 tacky years. It drove everyone away from the church, and we want to go back. But Sacrosanctum Concilium was done. It was done in a way that drove everyone away, and so we reacted like a good corporation would. Why is there any conceivable options I'm missing, Eric, about why they would refuse to go back? Why aren't they driving people from our midst for suggesting maybe we should reform the reform?
I think for some, there's elements in the church where it's having its intended effect, which is sending people away. That's what they want. I do think there's a large number of people, I'm talking about people who can make a change, like bishops and people like that, where it just is, you just don't want to admit failure. And they really believe that these are people who grew up in the 60s and 70s, things like that. They really believe that to get the hip young people, you need a hip young mass. And they think the new mass is the hip young mass.
I don't think anyone thinks that. I really honestly don't.
Have you seen your band at church?
Yeah,
I
don't.
Like the 70-year-old bishop thinks that he thinks that this is the way, that this is going to be attractive to young people, even though the evidence is screaming in his face it's not, because he's a 70-year-old man or something. I'm not trying to be ageist or whatever, but the fact is he simply can't. I know. He just simply thinks that. I'm not, and there's a whole range. Like I said, there's people who they're ideologically they have to support the new mass because it supports their whole modernist ideals. But I do think on the end of where you see the like you see a bishop, let's use somebody as a good example, a Bishop Chaput, formerly of Philadelphia. I don't know, has he actually retired? I don't know. Anyway, everybody knows who he is.
More ageism.
Yeah,
more
right.
Ageism.
Here's Bishop Chaput, a good man who is clearly wants to serve the church, wants to serve our Lord, but he's all in with, he's going to allow the Latin Mass. He's not against it, but he would never suggest that we should go back. And so I'm picking a good bishop as my example because I think somebody like him, I honestly think he believes that the old Mass is just a preference of an eccentric group of people like us. And it's not something that he believes that I don't want to speak to him, but I really think he would say if you tried to implement the extraordinary form universally, you would see a mass exodus for the doors and people would leave. And I do think it's possible if you implement it in a poor way, like if you just all of a sudden say, hey, next Sunday, guess what? You're all doing this. I mean, the priests wouldn't be prepared. The people wouldn't be prepared. There had to be catechesis and stuff to prepare for it. But I do think they believe that would be even worse than the exodus we've already seen, that you'd just be accelerating it. When the irony is, it was the implementation of the new Mass that was exactly the accelerator of an exodus that had already started before Vatican II. And so the fact that they think that the old Mass would do this is I think, kind of ironic, since that's exactly what the new Mass did.
If anyone's going to leave the church because of a change to a liturgical form, right? Because of going back to an older form of the Mass, then their heart's not really on fire for Christ. They didn't have much of a faith to begin with, right? If there's
Right.
anything that the church can say, like, we're changing this discipline where you're going to pull a Sean Hannity and just up and leave and become an apostate, one of these sins that was so bad that even in the early church, they struggled with, can this be forgiven? This is part of the reason for the public rite of penance in the early church, and they thought maybe this is an unforgivable sin to apostate yourself from the church. If you're going to just up and leave, possibly, or because of a change to a form of the Mass, like, you were not getting what you were supposed to be getting from the church anyway. When you're going and getting the Eucharist every week, you're just eating and drinking judgment on yourself. So it might be better for your soul. I mean, no, I'm not saying you should actually leave the church. You should never do that. But in a weird way, it's more honest to be like, well, I wasn't believing in this anyway, so I'm out. Versus, staying in and living the sacramental life and doing these things that you don't really believe, and doing with your body that which is not in your mind.
And I think most Catholics they just go to Mass each Sunday because that's what they do. And honestly, I think most Catholics, like that middle 80, 90%, would just keep going because they go every Sunday, and they're maybe not enthusiastic about being Catholic, but they're like, yeah, I'm going to go each Sunday, whatever. Whereas you have the ideologues who are the modernists. They would form their own church probably, and then the people on our end would be rejoicing. But I do think that most people would not all of a sudden up and leave. But I think that. And also, I just think that you do something for long enough time. To answer your question, Tim, also some more is you do something for long enough. There's a lot of pride involved in admitting when you're wrong. I mean, it's tough. It's
But
not
they
easy
were
for anybody.
celebrating, and there was no personal pride that seemed to be at stake, ostensibly, when they were celebrating in 1963, whenever Sacrosanctum Concilium came out, that the church had been wrong for 1,000 years. No pride at stake.
Yeah.
Now we just tried this circus-like experiment. An analogy in most cases. Sometimes St. Peter's actually has circuses
Literal.
there, but literal circuses. It's 50 years, and it would be a much smaller peccadillo to say, oh yeah, the Catholic Church remembered when they tried that funny little Episcopalian like service. I mean, which is really what.
Right.
So I that's the strangeness that even none of in this triumvirate here of great minds, even we're not getting at. There's psychologically, this is why I always go to evil motives are a little more widespread maybe than even you think, Eric. None of us know, but
right.
It's absolutely catastrophic. You can read us the numbers from Mass Exodus maybe in a second, but the writing is on the wall, as it were, and they are much more loath to admit that the last 50 years, which is not that big of a deal, it's a blip historically, has been a catastrophe, than they were to admit that the 1,000 years of liturgy before that was not a catastrophe, just it was imperfect because we're still the church militant, not the church triumphant. I mean, does that make sense? Why would, without evil motive, I just don't get what drives the perpetuation of this thing.
I think also it's whether or not you're personally invested in it. And I think this is the turning point, is that we will have more and more bishops and leaders of the church who never lived, they have no personal investment in the 1960s or even the 70s. And I think that will help, because it won't be them saying I was wrong. It will be saying these guys back in the 60s, 70s, who, I wasn't even alive back then, they were wrong. So I think that will make it easier as well. I also think it's, because it is truly, I know this is annoying when people say this, it is a complex issue. I do think it is complex in the sense that there were cultural changes, like I mentioned before, that did cause people to leave churches. For example, the mainline Protestants, they lost people too, and they never had a Vatican II. And so it's easy then to say, if you say, I think the changes that happened because of Vatican II are a primary cause of why people left, you'll immediately get thrown in your face. Well, no, the culture changed. See, they stopped going to the Methodist Church and the Episcopalian Church, all that stuff. And that's true. And it's not to say that if Vatican II never happened, the Catholic Church wouldn't have faced some some people leaving as well. I just feel like the data shows that it was like you're going towards a cliff, and what happened after Vatican II is the church put down they hit the accelerator. They didn't hit the brakes, they hit the accelerator. And so they just careened down way faster and way worse than they would have if they had not made these changes.
See,
And so
I think it's
that's
more
the
like,
excuse.
yeah, I think it's more like you've been driving next to a cliff, like with a team full of, human beings, in the back of your flatbed truck. And every time you hit a rock, there's no guardrail. People are flying over in spates. A few will fly over. You're driving next to the cliff. What I think Vatican II did is just drive completely into the cliff. Meaning the faithful people that are inside the truck with their seatbelts on are going to go down too. Given the modernist instantiations of liturgical forms insinuated by lex orandi, lex credendi. I mean, don't you? Because I don't think it was inevitable. I mean, what did the numbers show? This is a hunch. I don't think it was like we were going directly toward a cliff and just all this was going to happen. I see the most prominent role for Vatican II. What do you see?
Yeah, I think so as well. And by the way, I'm hoping we can get as many analogies as we can in this show. So a great book, and I recommend this to everybody. It's called Mass Exodus, and it was written by Stephen Bullivant. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his last name, so I apologize, Stephen, if you're watching. And it's a great book. And basically, what he did was he studied the numbers in England and in Britain, I should say, Britain and America. He studied the numbers of, okay, how many people left, and the surveys that asked him, why did you leave? And he wrote a great book, and he wants to answer the question, was it Vatican II's fault? And his conclusion, which is mine as well, is that you can't say it's Vatican II's fault, but you can say that Vatican II accelerated and possibly kept the church from preventing the decline. That there was a sense of a decline, but that Vatican II made it worse. And a great people don't really, I mean, I wasn't alive either. I know I'm old, but I'm not that old. I wasn't born until the 70s. But people don't really realize, and I remember I talked to my father-in-law, he's passed away now, just a great man. He lived through it. And he told me, he would tell me stories about it. And you read about this, how crazy, we think it's crazy now, how crazy it was in the late 60s, early 70s when it goes to parish life. You literally did not know what you were going to get when you went to Mass on Sunday, as far as, is it going to be in English? Is the priest going to be facing us, or is he going to be facing towards the altar? What are the songs going to be like? And you had no idea, because it started in 1964. So November, first Sunday of Advent, 1964, is when, in America and Britain at least, the church was allowed, pastors were allowed to change things about, it's still a traditional Latin Mass, but now they were allowed to say it in English, for example. They were allowed to face the people. Things like that all of a sudden started to creep in.
Really? It was that early?
1964. So Vatican II wasn't even over yet.
Right.
And so then over the next 5 years, because it was 1969 is when the Novus Ordo was promulgated. So over the next 5 years, you have a situation where it's Thunderdome. It's whatever people want to do. Each parish, some parishes are like, the priest is like, no, I'm celebrating Church Latin Mass like I've always done. Others would be elsewhere. I mean, my wife would tell a story about, she wasn't alive yet either, but her parents would say there was some discord in families, because you would have maybe the dad would want to keep going to the parish where it's Church Latin Mass, and the mom would be like, well, I want to go to the parish where it's this way. It's getting more modern. And you would have parishes where each priest would do it differently. So you literally didn't know. It depended on which priest was celebrating the Mass. And so you have this chaos that starts in late 1964, and then it becomes institutionalized in 1969. And now it's like, now the traditional Latin Mass is like no longer allowed. Well, here's some interesting numbers that is in this book. And a lot of dioceses, they track Mass attendance. They do these, usually they do it in October, because that's a good month where you don't have any summer vacations. You don't have any special things like Easter or Christmas. October is a month that often they do surveys, and they do Mass attendance. How many people go to Mass in your diocese? And a lot of dioceses do it, but they're not always consistent. But one diocese very near where I live, Columbus, Ohio, has done this every single year since 1958. They have done how many people go to Mass each on a Sunday. And if you look at the numbers, in 1958, it was 109,000 Catholics. And each year after that, it basically increased up until 1965. and it's 130. So you actually see that's a pretty sizable increase from 109 to 130,000 over the course of, 8 years. And so that's 1965. And basically every year it goes up a little bit. And then all of a sudden, 1966, it goes from 130 to 127. The next year, 121, 116. A little bit of a blip to 117, but then 116 again. And then it just starts to crater. And by 1980, for example, it's 106. By 1987, it's 96,000. Today, or 2017, which is the last data we have, it's 74,000, which is about half of what it was in 1965 at its peak. And remember, well, people might not actually know this. I live in this area. Columbus, Ohio is the city that's grown the most in Ohio. It has grown. I had the number somewhere else. It's grown a ton since 1965. So we're not talking about an area where people left, and that's why the mass attendance has gone down. The mass attendance is cratered in half in a time when they had way more people. Yeah, actually, I do have this here. The population in that time actually almost doubled in that time frame. And it was a 43% decrease in mass attendance when a population was doubling. And what's interesting about these numbers is how they happen literally right after the mass has changed. And I think it just makes sense that people start going to mass, and if it changes, if they don't like going, I know people like us have a tendency to, we have a certain faith and we would go hell or high water because we have to. That's not how most Catholics work. I mean, their faith might not be strong enough to withstand such major changes. Right. And so you see a direct decrease in mass attendance right at the exact same time that they change the mass. And now if you say, okay, I know the big thing, and I believe this too, correlation does not mean causation. That is true. But the fact is they changed the mass in order to get more people to go. And so
right.
That's why they changed it. And so
they changed it in order to affect a corollary, right? And the corollary failed. Yeah.
Right. So it's like, if they obviously, if you act like there's no causation at all, I think that's a worse sin than to say it's 100% causation. Like, I wouldn't say it's 100% causation because all these cultural factors happen. But to act like it's a 0% is just burying your head in the sand and just going whole hog on a failed experiment. And so I think that's the numbers show.
What exactly, aside from just the outward liturgical changes that obviously were ushered in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, there are other things that have driven people away from the church in this era, right? In the post-conciliar era, that are rooted in the implementation of the council, right? Not just liturgically, but also just things in parish life. Can you speak to those at all? Is there anything else that you can give us for why people left in the wake of Vatican II and in the wake of the changes that came down the pike?
Thank you for serving me up, because I'm literally writing a book about this right now. I think one of the biggest changes that happened is the rise of religious relativism inside the church. And so just to make sure everybody's clear, what I mean by that is religious relativism is the idea that all different religions are basically relative in their ability to get you to heaven or whatever you want to call the good afterlife. So it doesn't matter if you're Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Jewish, Muslim, even atheist, they're all basically the same as far as they're all going to get you to heaven. And so you become indifferent. And
different paths, they say.
Privileged.
Right, different paths.
We're the privileged path.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Bishop Barron. But religious relativism became a huge, in fact, it started to infect the church, I should say, in a huge way in the 1960s and 70s. If you read the documents of Vatican II, you will see the church talks about religious freedom. And I don't want to go down that whole path. I know, like, for example, Archbishop Lefebvre, God rest his soul, had some major issues with that. And I kind of disagree with him on that issue in some ways. But religious freedom is not the same as religious relativism. Saying the state should give people a certain amount of freedom to practice whatever religion they want is not the same as saying that all those religions will therefore end up with the same result, either in society or, more importantly, eternally. And so what happened is you see a huge rise in religious relativism within the church and within how things are practiced. And you see this in the actions of church leaders, which have an impact on the people. And, you know, a perfect example, which is more controversial in some circles, is, for example, John Paul II. When he had his prayer service in 1986 at Assisi with all these different religions, they were trying to be very careful, like, okay, we're not praying together, we're just happen to both praying at the same time for the same reason in the same place. But what's the signal does that send to people? That essentially the Pope and the Grand Imam and maybe the Archbishop of Canterbury and somebody, you know, all these chief rabbi of Rome, they're basically all equal. That
the meeting is the message.
Right.
Yeah. That's what Betty Friedan's aide said in the wake of Pope Paul VI meeting with her in, you know, the 70s, in 1975. The meeting is the message, even if he's going to step out and say, well, we don't envision the role of women changing in a drastic way, but we can dialogue. No, that's not how people see it. They see a meeting between two people, and they assume that there's some kind of a simpatico there, right?
Right. And nobody understands that more than our current Pope, and nobody weaponizes it more than our current Pope. That understands that he doesn't have to say, I believe that that homosexuality is okay or something like that. He can just simply have a lot of meetings with people who are active homosexuals or something like that, and then allow communion and all those things. So the point is that these actions have real impact. So get back to the point that if it's true that it doesn't really matter that you're Catholic, whether or not you're going to go to heaven or hell, why bother getting up on Sunday morning? What's the point? Because I tell you what, in 1930, you might not have been a very good Catholic, but you knew if you weren't Catholic, you're going to hell. Now, that itself isn't the teaching either if you look at the details of it, but that's basically what the man on the street, the Catholic on the street in the Catholic ghetto in 1930 thought, was if I'm not going to Mass on Sunday, I'm in big trouble when I die. And so when that's no longer true, when it's now 1990 and Father's talking like it doesn't matter, he's having a lot of meetings, all his ecumenical meetings with the local rabbis and the local Anglican churches and things like that, and it's all like one big happy family. Well, then why not either go to the Anglican church or not go at all? And so I think that's a major cause, and that's directly, I think, from Vatican II, at least the ethos of Vatican II. Like I say, Vatican II doesn't say that other religions are equal to the church. It doesn't say that. But the ethos of it, of having the Protestants come and be and at the council, and not only have them come, but if you read, oh my gosh, when you read about how these documents are written and developed, there was a huge influence of Protestants on every one of them. When they went to write something, they'd say, will the Protestants accept this or not? Will it be offensive to them or not? And if it was at all offensive, they changed the wording so it wouldn't be offensive to them.
Co-redemptrix of Mary, the co-redemptrix of Mary. They, in a footnote in what document was that? It might be Gaudium et Spes. Yeah, it literally says, because this would Lumen Gentium, this would be offensive to our separated brethren. It's like, what do I care? They're these are the arch heretics. Like, this is nuts. So that's all over the documents, time and time again. So don't tell me those documents are spotless. That's perverse. This is up calling itself down when you say these heretics will be offended by the idea of Mary. It's like, where am I?
Right. Yeah, and people don't realize the message that these things send, because what you get sometimes, you get conservative Orthodox Catholics, good people, but they'll be sticklers for the documents. Like, well, the document doesn't say that, or Pope John Paul II didn't say that in his document, or Pope Francis doesn't say that. But people are not taught by documents alone. You get taught by a lot of things. You get taught by osmosis in a lot of ways. You see things, you experience things. What does the priest talk about each Sunday in his homily? Does he never, ever, ever once bring up contraception and how it's evil? Well, all those things teach. And so it doesn't, in the end, the documents become dead letters. What matters is how it is lived out in the church. And so when all of a sudden it's lived out in most Catholic parishes that all religions are essentially equal in practice, then there's no real point in being Catholic other than, like, okay, my parish it's got better music than the Anglican one down the church, or I just feel like going here because they have a good education for my kids, instead of, oh, I need to go here because my eternal salvation depends upon it. And when you have that difference, people are just going to leave like crazy.
And this is the concept of prima theologia, right? The liturgy and it's the Mrs. Murphys of the world who are not trained in theology. They have no formal schooling, but they pick up from liturgy these profound concepts through osmosis, right? Because there is the Spirit at work in the liturgy. There is the Spirit who is in a way catechizing people. So they always call, this is the concept of lex orandi, a lex credendi, right? The law of prayer is the law of belief. And the people sitting in the pews, they understand from their experience liturgically deep truths about the faith. And so what happens to the liturgy, so goes the liturgy, so goes the state of people's souls. And it's something that's really important to keep in mind. You can't just say, well, to hell with it. The church can do whatever she wants with the liturgy. No, we're playing. It's a high stakes game. People's souls are at stake because they're going to see what's happening. There's an evangelical component to the liturgy where we're actually picking up. It's catechizing us, right?
Right. And the funny thing is, the irony about the fact that you say the liturgy is evangelical is that the purpose of the liturgy is not to evangelize, but a result of the liturgy properly done is to evangelize. And what happened is that people started to look at the liturgy as this way, we're going to reach out to people, we're going to make it more relevant for people, more attractive for people, and that will attract them. The problem is their whole thinking is backwards. When you are designing the Mass, so to speak, you are thinking, I need to worship God the best way I can. Everything is directed towards Him and the proper worship of God. But then as a result, what happens is people see that, and then that attracts them to say, oh, yes, I need to give worship to God in my whole life. I need to give my whole life to Him. And so you see that's the result of it. And so what happened is we have all these changes. Like, think about any time they talk about making a change to the Mass, which seems like every week sometimes, but it's always a matter of we need to do it because it'll be better for people it'll be more relevant to them. It'll be more part of our culture, be more that attract people. There's never a thought of, no, we need to do the liturgy in the way that honors God the most. And then by doing that, like I said, the result is going to be people will be attracted to that. And I think that's a major problem. And you see that in those numbers that when they started to tinker with the Mass, it had an effect on Mrs. Murphy. Mrs. Murphy's like, this ain't what I signed up for. It doesn't seem to matter. It became a chat, social hour where Father's now facing you the whole time. He's cracking his jokes, maybe sometimes even during the canon, and he's just talking, having a good old time with you, never talking about anything of importance, and really essentially saying nothing different than what the Anglican down the street was saying, or the evangelical Protestant was. Actually, the evangelical Protestant probably is saying better things. And so it's like, why even bother showing up? And I think but like you said, it's so much, the liturgy is the key point. And you get this a lot where people, when they fight against traditional Catholics, like, you're just obsessed with the liturgy, with the Mass. And in a sense, they're right, because it is the focal point. It is what Mrs. Murphy sees week in, week out, is the Mass. And she is catechized by how the priest celebrates Mass, what the priest is wearing, what's on the altar, what statues are there, how the church is designed, the architecture of the church, how the ushers are acting during Mass, how all these things catechize her in ways she doesn't even realize. And we're catechized too by all these things. And so when you go into a Latin Mass parish, especially one that is able to have their own church building, you are catechized all these different ways. It does feel like a different religion than when you walk into your local suburban Catholic parish that looks like a used airport hangar, and it just has nothing Catholic about it.
And liturgy forms doctrine. People think that it's the other way around.
Airport hangar.
People think it's the other way around, that doctrine is formative of liturgy. But if you look back to Acts, and you see St. Basil defending the divinity of the Holy Spirit based on the canon of the Mass, right? And you look back to how the canon of Scripture was put together. It was based on what was used in early liturgy. Liturgy is formative of doctrine. And of course, there's this symbiotic relationship where then doctrine and apostolic paradosis formed liturgy, right? But at the same time, liturgy is formative of doctrine, and it's the key by which we can tell the soundness of doctrine. So goes liturgy, so goes doctrine. And what you see when there is this debasing of liturgy, you're going to get a debasing of doctrine. And I think my understanding is that's what's happened, and what your contention is leading a lot of people away.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting because in the Arian crisis of the 4th century, St. Athanasius defended doctrine by basically, one of his arguments was, the reason we know that Jesus is the eternal God the Son is because we have worshiped him in the liturgy for the past 300 years.
Right.
And that was the reason why they knew, because otherwise you would be saying what we've been doing for the past couple hundred years is blasphemous idolatry, because we've been worshiping in the liturgy. Therefore, the doctrine must be that Jesus Christ is God, the eternal God, the Son, against the Arians. It was the liturgy forming the doctrine. And then, like you said, the doctrine starts to form the liturgy, because then they create the Nicene Creed, which becomes part of the liturgy. So it works back and forth.
Common sense dictates that having a diversity of rites in the Catholic Church, not just the Roman rite, but the other ones, suggests a kind of fungibility. And I understand historically these things developed like from the schism, because we wanted to keep as many people. It's a bargain between practicality and principle. We wanted to keep as many of the Eastern Rite people, so we created that rite. Now they're talking about creating the Pachamama rite. I always thought this privately. Recently, from the Brazilian villain bishops like Claudio Humes and the all the usual suspects in Germany, they have begun pointing at the diversity of rites, and they say, hey, look, in defense of outright outstripping of celibacy among priests, things like this, they say, look at the Anglican ordinariate, man. Look at what is practiced even in the Eastern rites. We don't hear these rigids and these retrogrades out there complaining about all of the variant rites. I've always kind of intuitively objected. We really shouldn't there really just be one rite? I know a bunch of the Byzantine Catholics and the Maronites and all that are going crazy, but it is the universal church. Latin is the universal language, so why not just have one universal rite? I don't think it's as complex as people say.
Wow, you're really dropping the controversy down here. Here I'm going to disagree with you. And here's one reason is personal, is because I first became in love with a reverent traditional liturgy through the Eastern rites. I would go to a Melkite church, not regularly, but semi-regularly when I lived in Washington, D.C. area. And that was the first time I saw liturgy done right, so to speak, because I'd converted only maybe 10 years before, and I just was your typical suburban Catholic parish liturgy is what I normally saw. And here is where I go back to my principle before. Rites, the villains today who try to use the Eastern rites as a defense of their idolatrous crap is, again, the problem with that is, again, slow and organic. The
True.
Eastern rites have a slow and organic development. The Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, for example, it dates back to the first days of the early church. And so we have this organic development where legitimately in the first few hundred years of the church, we already see it's way more complex than this, but we see a split in the sense of how the liturgy happened. We see the Western Roman style, which has always been austere, very precise, very keeps relatively simple, very militaristic. Whereas in the East, you had the personalities, which are much more expressive and effusive. I mean, they want to say, Lord have mercy, as many times as possible in one liturgy. And so you have this legitimate cultural difference between the East and the West. And so their liturgies developed slowly and organically. They developed differently, but they kept the same. And I think that's the same essence. And I think that's where you can have this legitimate diversity in the Catholic Church of the Eastern rites, that they have had their own slow and organic. But throwing out a Pachamama rite, for example, other than the fact that it literally is from the devil, would be the fact that it's new and it's by committee again. So.
Yeah, no, and before I get a bunch of hate mail, we're wrapping up here. I know that's the correct answer. I know it's actually a good correct answer, not just a politically correct answer. And it always boils down to the distinction you made in like minute 15 of this interview, Eric, is the difference between organic and inorganic change is actually a distinction of kind, not a distinction of degree. It makes all the difference. And I understand even when you talk about the Eastern versus the Western historical unraveling of sacrament, mysterion, it follows that Eastern sense of liturgy is more holistic and beautiful and mystical, versus sacramentum is a militaristic conception of the sacraments, much as you said of the Western Latin mass as it unfolded. And then you have Saint Jerome interpreting the Bible into Latin, so now it's kind of Latin versus Greek, and then you have Constantinople being moved, the center of Christendom being moved from Rome in the west to Constantinople in the east, and then you have our problem is the constant influx in the west of interlopers like the Visigoths and Vandals, who are all Arianists, and we're always kind of accommodating them. We always accommodate in the Western Church. In the East, they had none of that nonsense. All they really had to deal with was the Mohammedans starting in the early 600s. So there are real differences that organically drove us apart. And I'm kind of just noodling with the idea. I'm definitely in the camp of let's just bring the Roman Rite back to the real Roman Rite, what's called the extraordinary Roman Rite. Of all these 19 rites or whatever, if you total them up, we're the only one that's bimodal, and it's ridiculous.
Right. Yeah, the idea of two forms is an innovation I understand the purpose Pope Benedict had when he did it, but it is an innovation. And innovation is
it's like having two popes. No, I mean not that. No, but I mean literally. I'm not a Benny Plenist or whatever it's called. But literally, Pope Benedict innovated the same concept of a Pope Emeritus.
Right.
And
terrible idea.
Literally, what he admits to. I'm not suggesting anything else. Eric, you're a good dude for someone that is from the same state as LeBron James, and I say that.
I want to make sure it's an official record that LeBron James is my most hated player as well. So I just want to make sure that is official.
That's why you're a good man.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's not accidental to my last compliment.
Yeah, right. There you go.
That is the source of my last. Yeah, I had a friend who was from Akron. His wife is from Akron, and she said that it's just good people. So I'm trying to forgive her for saying this, but she said, I'm so proud that I'm from Akron and LeBron James is from Akron. I was like, I have to show you the door because he's the devil.
That's a friendship right there.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, man. But thanks for all the the brotherhood on the interwebs. It's just good to meet non-crazies that are really, really in similar headspace to us. You've worked it out. Tacky does not mean invalid. I'm going to get a tattoo that says tacky does not mean invalid about the liturgy. And so many people are militantly on one side or the other on that. And it's like, no, I want to go back to the Latin Mass. And it just seems like you bring that level of aplomb and kind of delicacy to everything I say, every article I've ever read. I'm looking forward to your book, by the way. I really appreciate your prudential judgments on the interwebs. What's your book going to be called?
It's going to be called, I think right now, is Deadly Indifference, How Religious Relativism Has Wrecked the Catholic Parish.
Cool. When can we expect it out?
When can we?
Yeah, it's going to be a while. I'm still in the business of writing it. I would guess it would be the end of this year, 2020, or early 2021.
So we'll expect it in 2025 because we're writers too. We know what that means. So
I try very hard, but
yeah, cool. Well, thanks for coming on with us, and we will see you around the dramatic interwebs, probably debating hotly Coke versus Pepsi. Not that you bring that up, but people all want to drag us into their drama, and I always see you along the way, and I always agree.
Yeah, we'll keep grifting.
Yeah. You too. Oh no, you don't. You've never been called a grifter. It's
well, I have been called
us and the mysterious Steve.
I know. Steve and Taylor. Yeah, it's terrible.
Keep on grifting.
We'll do it.
Keep grifting. Get a shirt. Like
I
keep
should.
trucking.
Yeah, exactly.
High Plains grifter.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, peace out and thanks for being with us.